Section 3 of Great Events in the History of North and South America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Helen Sayers. Great Events in the History of North and South America by Charles Goodrich. United States Early Discoveries, Christopher Columbus. It is not ascertained in what year the birth of this illustrious individual occurred. Some authorities have placed it in 1446. Others have removed it back 8 or 10 years farther. As he died in 1506 and was said by Bernaldez, one of his contemporaries and intimates, to have departed in a good old age of 70, a little more or less, it would seem, abating the vagueness of the expression, that about 1436 was the period. The place of his birth also has been a subject of controversy, but the evidence is decidedly in favor of Genoa. His parentage was humble, though probably of honorable descent. It is generally believed that his father exercised the craft of a wool carder or weaver. Christopher was the eldest of 4 children, having 2 brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, and 1 sister, who was obscurely connected in life. In his early youth he was instructed at Pavia, a place then celebrated for education, and is said there to have acquired that taste for mathematical studies in which he afterwards excelled. Of geographical science he was particularly enamored, as it became also to be the favorite study of an adventurous age. It doubtless gave a direction in some measure to the course which Columbus pursued in life. At the early age of 14 years, he began to follow the seas, and after continuing this profession for more than 16 years, he proceeded to Portugal, the country of maritime enterprise at that era. Hither the adventurous spirits of Europe repaired, where they sought their fortunes in this department of business. Columbus mingled in the exciting scenes of the country and the times. Sailing from thence, he continued to make voyages to the various then known parts of the world, and while on shore, he occupied his time in the construction and sale of maps and charts. Thus furnished with all the nautical science of the times, and with a large fund of experience, he was prepared to enter upon those speculations respecting the possibility of lands lying beyond the western waters, the result of which, when put into practice, proved to be so auspicious to the interests of mankind. What will not a single thought, when pursued as it may be, sometimes effect? In our hero it brought to light the existence of a new world. His single object appeared to be to find the eastern shores of Asia, or some unknown tract by sailing due west. How far that idea was original with him, it is not very material to ascertain. If not the first individual to conceive it, he was the first to carry it into execution. That land existed beyond the Atlantic was a conjecture merely of the ancients. Seneca comes the nearest to a direct intimation, though as a poetic fancy it claims no serious consideration. As the idea is given by Freneau, he says, "The time shall come when numerous years are past, the ocean shall dissolve the band of things, and an extended region rise at last. And Typhus shall disclose the mighty land, far, far away, where none have roamed before. Nor shall the world's remotest region be Gibraltar's rock or Tule's savage shore." Ferdinand Columbus informs us that his father's conviction of the existence of land in the West was founded on 1. Natural reason, or the deductions of science; 2. Authority of writers, amounting, however, to vague surmises; 3. Testimony of seafaring persons, or rather popular rumors of land described in Western voyages, embracing such relics as appeared to be wafted from over the Atlantic to Europe. What particular intimations he may have received, either from authors or sailors, do not appear. Since, in his voyage to Iceland, no mention is made of his having learned the story of the Scandinavian voyages to the northern portion of America. It is possible, however, that he may have been informed of them, and the reason why no mention was made by him was, as M. Humboldt conjectures, that he had no conception that the land discovered by the Northmen had any connection with the region of which he was in pursuit. The traditions which he may have met with, and the speculations of the times, were realized in his view. So strong was the conviction which had been wrought in his mind, from whatever cause, he was willing to jeopard life and fortune to put it to the test of experiment. With this grand object before him, he first submitted his theory of a western route to the Indies to John II, King of Portugal. He met with no countenance from this quarter. His project, in its vastness, was in advance of the comprehension of the age. John was not unwilling clandestinely to avail himself of information communicated to him by Columbus, but he would enter into no stipulation to aid him in the enterprise. Leaving the court of Lisbon in disgust, in the latter part of 1484, Columbus repaired to the Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand and Isabella. The time of the application was peculiarly unfavorable, as the nation was then in the midst of the Moorish War, and needed for its prosecution all the pecuniary resources of the state. The persons of influence, also in the court, were destitute of those enlarged views which are essential to a just appreciation of the scheme that fired the great mind of Columbus. With these causes of discouragement, and the submission of his proposal on the part of the sovereigns to a council chiefly of ecclesiastics, he had little reason to expect a favorable issue. After waiting years in the most agitating suspense and doubt, for the council would come to no decision, he was preparing to abandon the suit. Pressing the court for a definite answer at that juncture, they at last gave him to understand that his scheme was vain, impracticable, and resting on grounds too weak to merit the support of the government. In deep despondency he quitted the court, and took his way to the south, as if in desperation to seek other patronage in other quarters. From the period of his application to the Spanish court to that at which we are now arrived in his history, it would seem that he made several attempts to interest other distinguished personages in his scheme, particularly the citizens of his native Genoa. But the early authorities so disagree among themselves that the chronology of his movements previously to his first voyage cannot be determined with precision. It is certain, however, that while in the act of leaving Spain, probably for the court of the French king, from whom he had received a letter of encouragement, he was purposely detained by a friend, Juan Perez, who had formerly been a confessor of Isabella, for the purpose of trying the effect of another application to the Spanish sovereigns. This measure, seconded by the influence of several distinguished individuals, and occurring just at the triumphant termination of the Moorish War, had well nigh proved successful at once. But Columbus was again doomed to disappointment. The single obstacle in the way now was not the disinclination of Ferdinand and Isabella, but what were deemed the extravagant demands of Columbus himself. He would not consent to engage in the undertaking, except on the condition that he and his heirs should receive the title of Admiral and Viceroy over all lands discovered by him, with 1/10 of the profits. This demand was the means of breaking up the negotiations, and that at the moment when he seemed to be on the point of realizing the visions which he had fondly indulged through long years of vexation, trouble, and disappointment. That he would consent to dash those bright visions rather than surrender one of the rewards due to his service, is, in the language of our Prescott, the most remarkable exhibition in his whole life of that proud, unyielding spirit which sustained him through so many years of trial, and enabled him to achieve his great enterprise in the face of every obstacle which man and nature had opposed to it. Columbus, again having turned his back from the scene of the negotiations, had proceeded only a few leagues distant when he was recalled by the royal message. The Queen, in the meanwhile, had yielded to the dictates of her own noble and generous nature, having been convinced of the importance of the enterprise by the powerful representations of the friends of our hero. She said at once in answer, "I will assume the undertaking for my own crown of Castile, and will pledge my private jewels to raise the necessary funds if the means in the treasury should be found inadequate." The money, however, was furnished by the receiver of the revenues of Aragon, and subsequently refunded at the instance of Ferdinand. The conditions on which Columbus had insisted in the event of discovery were finally granted. He was constituted by the United Sovereigns their admiral, viceroy, and governor-general of all such countries as he should discover in the Western Ocean. He was to be entitled to 1/10 of the products and profits within the limits of his discoveries. These, with other privileges of a like kind, not necessary to name here, were settled on him and his heirs forever. Thus possessing the royal sanction, Columbus immediately entered upon the arrangements required to prosecute the voyage. Isabella urged it forward to the extent of her power. Delay, however, unavoidably occurred, on account of the opposition or indifference of the local magistrates and the people where the equipment was to be made. This obstacle was at length removed by stern edicts on the part of the government and by the energy of Columbus. The fleet consisted of 3 vessels, one furnished by himself through the assistance of his friends, and was to sail from the little port of Palos in Andalusia. 2 of the vessels were caravels, that is, light vessels without decks. The other was of a larger burden, though not amounting even to 100 tons. How such craft could survive the waves and storms of the Atlantic is one of the marvelous circumstances of the undertaking. The number of men received on board amounted to 120. The preparations having been finished, the undaunted navigator set sail on the morning of the 3rd of August, 1492, having first with his whole crew partaken of the sacrament. He soon directed his course to the Canary Islands, in consequence of the condition of one of the vessels, called the Pinta, whose rudder had been found to be unfit for service. This, after a detention of more than 3 weeks, was repaired, and they then, on the 6th of September, proceeded on their voyage. On the 4th day, land ceased to be in sight, and now the fearful reality of their condition pressed upon the minds of the sailors with overpowering weight. They had been pressed into the service, and from the beginning were averse to the enterprise. Columbus had reason, therefore, to expect the open manifestation of discontent, if not insubordination and mutiny. The first exhibition of their feelings upon losing sight of land was that of alarm and terror. Many of them shed tears and broke out into loud lamentations. All before them seemed to be mystery, danger, and death. It was by no means easy to quell their fears, and it required all the address of the admiral to effect it. Their minds were, in a degree, soothed for that time by the promises of land and riches, which he addressed to their wants or their cupidity. Every unusual incident, however, on the voyage was calculated to awaken their gloomy and distressing apprehensions, such as the sight of a part of a mast when they had sailed some 150 leagues, and the variation of the needles. The former presented to their imagination the probable wreck of their own frail barks. The variation of the needle created surprise even in the mind of the admiral, but to his crew the circumstance seemed perfectly terrific. They felt as if the very laws of nature were undergoing a change, and the compass was about to lose its virtues and its power as a guide over the waste of waters. Columbus, however, by ascribing the variation of the needle to the change of the polar star itself, satisfied the minds of his pilots inasmuch as they entertained a high opinion of his knowledge of astronomy. The distance at which they were every day carried from their homes was a source of accumulating uneasiness. Every sort of superstitious fear was indulged in. One while, the prevalence of winds from the east excited their apprehensions that a return to Spain was impracticable. At another time, the slight southwest breezes and frequent calms, causing the ocean to seem like a lake of dead water, made them feel that they were in strange regions where nature was out of course and all was different from that to which they had been accustomed. Here they thought they might be left to perish on stagnant and boundless waters. Now they seemed to themselves to be in danger of falling on concealed rocks and treacherous quicksands, then of being inextricably entangled in vast masses of seaweed which lay in their path. Although Columbus had contrived to keep his men ignorant of the real distance they had come, yet the length of time could but tell them that they must be far, very far from country and home, and that their ever going on to the west would at length place the east too remote from them to hope ever reaching it. They had been occasionally cheered with what were deemed indications of their proximity to land, such as the flying of birds about their fleet, the patches of weeds and herbs covering the surface of the water, and a certain cloudiness in the distant horizon, such as hangs over land. But these had proved fallacious, and the higher hope was raised by such appearances, the deeper was its fall when the appearances passed away. This state of things led to murmurs and discontent, and at one time the crew were on the point of combining in open and desperate rebellion. The power which the great admiral possessed over the minds of men was never more signalized than in putting down this spirit of insubordination and mutiny. He was perfectly aware of their intentions, but preserved a serene and steady countenance. He seemed intuitively to understand in what way to address himself to the different portions of his company. Some he soothed with gentle words. Of others he stimulated the pride or avarice by the offers of honors and rewards. The most refractory he openly menaced with condign punishment, should they make the slightest attempt at impeding the voyage. After the experience of long-continued calms, the wind sprang up in a favorable direction, and they were enabled efficiently to prosecute their voyage. This was on the 25th of September, and the vessels sailing quite near to each other, a frequent interchange of conversation took place on the subject most interesting to them, their probable position as to land. In the midst of it, a shout from the Pinta was heard on board the Santa Maria, the admiral's ship. "Land! Land!" the signal pointing to the southwest. Columbus, who had found cause on other occasions to dissent from the opinions of his men, gave way in this instance to the joyful feelings which were at once excited in their bosoms. But it proved at length that what appeared to be land was nothing more than an evening cloud of a peculiar kind. Thus were their hopes dashed, and nothing remained for them but to press onward. Fain would the crew have turned back upon their course, but the commander was sternly resolute on realizing his magnificent project, and pressed forward still deeper into mid-ocean. It is a necessary explanation of the character of this extraordinary man that he appeared all along to view himself under the immediate guardianship of heaven in this solemn enterprise. He consequently felt few or none of the misgivings which so strongly affected his associates. For several days longer they continued on, till on the 1st of October they had advanced more than 700 leagues since the Canary Islands were left behind. Again the murmurs of the crew were renewed, but in this instance became soon hushed by increasing tokens of their nearness to land. Indeed, so sanguine were they on the subject that on the 7th of October, on board of the Nina, land was again announced, but it proved a delusion, and all except Columbus were ready to abandon hope. At the end of 3 days more, they saw the sun, after renewed appearances betokening their neighborhood to land, go down upon a shoreless horizon. At this time the turbulence of the crew became clamorous. They insisted upon turning homeward and abandoning the voyage as a forlorn hope. The commander now, after trying to pacify them by kind words and large promises, and trying in vain, arose in the majesty of his undaunted heart, and gave them to understand that all murmuring would be fruitless, and that, with God's blessing, he would accomplish the purpose for which his sovereigns had sent him on a voyage of discovery. Fortunately, at this juncture, when the conduct of Columbus had become nearly desperate, the indications of neighboring land could not be mistaken. Besides fresh weed, the limb of a tree, a reed, and a small board, they picked up an artificially carved staff. Soon despondency and rebellion gave way to hope, and throughout the day every person on board of the little fleet was on the watch for the long-wished-for land. The following evening was a time of intense anxiety to Columbus. He could but infer that he was near to the goal of his adventures and his hopes, but was it so indeed? That was the question, and it must now be soon decided. Would the night reveal it to him? Would its discovery settle forever the truth of his theory and bring to him the immortal honor which he sought as the end of all his toil and suffering? Taking his station in a conspicuous part of his vessel, he maintained an intense and unremitting watch. A few hours only had transpired when suddenly he thought he beheld a light glimmering at a great distance. One and another was called to examine the appearance in order to confirm the commander in his impression, if indeed it was correct. They gave their opinion in the affirmative. Soon, however, the light disappeared, and few attached any importance to it except Columbus. They pursued their course until 2 in the morning, when from the Pinta, which generally sailed ahead, the thundering signal was heard, the order being that a gun should be fired as soon as land hove in sight. It was indeed land at this time. It lay before them, now dimly seen, about 2 leagues distant. The joy which Columbus and his crew felt at the sight surpasses the power of description. It is difficult, even for the imagination, to conceive the emotions of such a man in whose temperament a wonderful enthusiasm and unbounded aspiration prevailed at the moment of so sublime a discovery. Utterance was given to his intense feelings by tears and prayers and thanksgivings. It was on the morning of Friday, 12th of October, 1492, that Columbus first saw the New World. A beautiful, fragrant, verdure-crowned island lay before him, and evidently populous, for the inhabitants were seen darting in great numbers through the woods to the shore. That greenhouse appearance which the regions within the tropics are known generally to assume, together with the purity and blandness of the atmosphere, struck the senses of the voyagers as though it had been Eden itself. They could give vent to their feelings only in tears of gratitude, in prayers and praises to God, who had conducted them to such happy destinies. Having made the necessary preparations, Columbus landed with his crew on the delightful shore in an ecstasy of joy and devotion, taking possession of the whole region in the name of his sovereigns and calling the island San Salvador. It proved to be one of what has since been known as the Bahama Islands. The conduct and appearance of the natives were such as to show that the Spaniards had no reason to fear their hostility or treachery. Simple, harmless, naked, and unarmed, they seemed rather to be at the mercy of their visitors. Equally timid and curious, they were at first shy, but being encouraged to approach the strangers, they at length became entirely familiar with them and received presents with expressions of the highest delight. The newcomers to their shores were thought to have dropped from the skies, and the articles bestowed were received as celestial presents. All was a scene of wonder and amazement, indeed, to both parties. As Columbus supposed himself to have landed on an island at the extremity of India, he gave to the natives the general appellation of Indians, by which, as a distinct race, they have ever since been known. After having noticed the features of the new-found island sufficiently, and learned what he was able from the natives in respect to other lands or islands, and particularly in respect to the gold they might contain, he explored the archipelago around, touched at several of the groups, and finally discovered the larger and more distant islands of Cuba and Hispaniola. Many interesting adventures occurred during his sojourn among these islands, in his intercourse with the natives, upon which we cannot enlarge. Suffice it to say that he succeeded according to his wishes in conciliating the affections of the people, and in the extent of his discoveries for the first voyage, but found a less amount of gold than he expected, and was unfortunate in the shipwreck of the Santa Maria, the principal vessel. His trials also with several of his subordinates in office were severe, as on more than one occasion they proved unfaithful to his interests and disobedient to his commands. It was on the 4th of January, 1493, that Columbus set sail for Spain. He left a part of his men in the island of Hispaniola, Haiti in the language of the original inhabitants, to occupy a fort he had built near a harbor which he had named La Navidad. While coasting on the eastern side of the island, he met the Pinta, which had for a time, under its disaffected captain, deserted from him. Joined by this vessel again, they proceeded homeward on their voyage, but they met with tempests which their frail barks were little able to encounter. The Pinta, being separated from the Nina, was supposed to have been lost, but this proved to have been a mistake, as she reached Spain nearly at the same time with the other caravel. At the time of their greatest extremity, when all hope of safety had departed, Columbus, anxious that the knowledge of his discovery might be communicated to the world, wrote a brief account of his voyage, and having properly secured it in a barrel, committed the latter to the ocean, in the hope that it might afterwards be found should he and his crew never see land again. But they were mercifully preserved as the storm at length subsided, and within a few days they reached the island of St. Mary's, one of the Azores. While he was at that island, where he had sought a refuge for his wearied men and his own overtasked body and mind, he encountered a species of persecution most disgraceful to civilized society. It was the result of the mean malignity of the Portuguese, who were piqued that the honor of the discovery should not have been secured for themselves, and was manifested by the imprisonment of a portion of his crew and other vexatious treatment. At length, regaining his men, he set sail for home, but meeting with tempestuous weather, he was forced to take shelter in the Tagus. Here, astonishment and envy seemed to be equally excited by the knowledge of his discoveries, and, could certain courtiers of the monarch have had their own way, the great adventurer would have been stricken down by the hand of the assassin. So black a deed of treacherous villainy had been advised. The king, however, treated him with generosity, and Columbus, being dismissed with safety, soon found himself entering the harbor of Palos, just 7 months and 11 days since his departure from that port. His arrival in Spain excited the most lively feelings of astonishment, joy, and gratitude. The nation was swayed by one common sentiment of admiration of the man and his exploits. Ferdinand and Isabella, who seemed to derive so much glory from his success, most of all participated in this sentiment. He was the universal theme, and most amply was he indemnified by the honors now bestowed upon him, and the enthusiasm with which he was everywhere welcomed for all the neglect and contumely he had previously suffered as a supposed insane or fanatical projector. His progress through Spain was like the triumphal march of a conqueror, but it is impossible, within the limited compass of this narrative, to present anything like an adequate idea of the sensation which was produced throughout the nation and Europe at large by the events that had thus transpired, or to enumerate the 100th part of the marks of consideration which the observed of all observers received from prince and peasant, from the learned and ignorant. The government confirmed anew to him all the dignities, privileges, and emoluments for which he had before stipulated, and others were added to them. But to Columbus the most satisfactory consideration accorded to him by his sovereigns at this time was the request to attempt a second voyage of discovery. For this the preparations were on a scale commensurate to the object in view. The complement of the fleet amounted to 1,500 souls. Among these were many who enlisted from love of adventure or glory, including several persons of rank, hidalgos, and members of the royal household. The squadron consisted of 17 vessels, 3 of which were of 100 tons burden each. With a navy of this size so strongly contrasting with that of his former voyage, he took his departure from the Bay of Cadiz on the 25th of September, 1493. He sailed on a course somewhat south of west, instead of due west as before, and after being up on the sea 1 month and 7 days, he came to a lofty island, to which he gave the name of Dominica, from having discovered it on Sunday. The liveliest joy was felt by the numerous company, and devout thanks were returned to God for their prosperous voyage. Sad reverses, however, awaited the great commander during this voyage of discovery. The garrison which he had left on the island of Hispaniola had disappeared, and the natives seemed less favorably disposed towards the white man than at first, a change which probably accounts for the fate of the garrison. Columbus, indeed, added other islands to the list of those before known, planted stations here and there on the principal island above named, and showed his usual unequalled energy and skill in the conduct of the expedition. But as he could not be everywhere at once, his absence from a place was the sure signal of misrule and insubordination among that class of adventurers who had never been accustomed to subjection or labor. His cautious and conciliating policy in the treatment of the natives was abandoned, where he could not be present to enforce it, and the consequence was that they were aroused to resentment on account of the injuries inflicted upon them. The treatment of the female natives on the part of the colonists was of that scandalous character calculated to produce continual broils and collisions. Eventually, a fierce warlike spirit was excited among portions of this naturally gentle and timid people, but they proved to be unequal to the civilized man, with the superior arms and discipline of the latter, in hostile encounter, and were driven before him as the leaves of autumn before a storm. There was such a war of extermination that in less than 4 years after the Spaniards had set foot on the island of Hispaniola, 1/3 of its population, amounting probably to several 100,000, was destroyed. Complaints were made by the colonists against the administration of Columbus, so that eventually he felt the necessity of returning home to vindicate his proceedings. Ferdinand and Isabella, however, took no part with the malcontents against him. They treated him with marked distinction, but it was evident that with the novelty of his discoveries, the enthusiasm of the nation had passed away. It was generally felt to be a losing concern. The actual returns of gold and other products of the New World were so scanty as to bear no proportion to the outlays. A third expedition was projected, and after various hindrances, arising from the difficulty of meeting the expense and the apathy of the public, Columbus took his departure from the port of St. Lucas, May 30th, 1498. Proceeding in a still more southerly direction than before, on the 1st of August following, he succeeded in reaching terra firma. He thus entitled himself to the glory of discovering the great southern continent, for which he had before prepared the way. It is not necessary to detail the events of this expedition, except to say that it proved a source of untold evil and suffering to the veteran navigator. After his arrival at Hispaniola, he was involved in inextricable difficulties with the colonists, the final result of which was that he was sent home in chains. This shocking indignity was the unauthorized act of a commissioner named Boadilla, sent out by the government to adjust the differences that had taken place. The King and Queen of Spain thus became unwittingly the cause of his disgrace. This was too much for the kind and generous feelings of the Queen in particular. Columbus was soothed by the assurances of her sympathy and sorrow for his trials. When he beheld the emotion of his royal mistress and listened to her consolatory language, it was too much for his loyal and generous heart, and throwing himself on his knees, he gave vent to his feelings and sobbed aloud. As an indication of the continued confidence of the king and queen in his fidelity, wisdom, and nautical skill, they proposed to him a fourth voyage. To this he assented with some reluctance at first, but cheered by their assurances, he quitted the port of Cadiz on the 9th of March, 1502, with a small squadron of 4 caravels. This was his last voyage, and more disastrous than any which preceded it. Among other misfortunes, he was wrecked on the island of Jamaica, where he was permitted to linger more than a year through the malice of Ovando, the new governor of St. Domingo. On his return, the 7th of November, 1504, after a most perilous and tedious voyage, he was destined to feel the heaviest stroke of all in the death of his most constant and liberal supporter, the Queen, and with her death to fail of that public justice which he had looked for as the crown of all his labors, hardships, and sacrifices. The king, always wary and distrustful, though he treated Columbus with high public consideration, seems to have regarded him in the unwelcome light of a creditor, whose demands were never to be disavowed and too large to be satisfied. The great discoverer lived only a year and a half after his return, and though poorly compensated by the king in his last days, he bore his trials with patience, and died on the 5th of May, 1506, in the most Christian spirit of resignation. End of section 3.